Welcome to SB 408D Entrepreneurship. My name is Felicia Frida Aidan Aqua. I'll be taking you through this unit. In this unit, Unit 6, we're looking at small business finance. Specifically, we're going to focus our discussion on long-term business finance, which is Section 2. By the end of this session, you should be able to list the various sources of long-term financing and discuss the sources of this long-term financing we're going to look out for in there. So to commence off, we should have in mind that when it comes to the length of time, we have the short term and we have the long term. Usually short term is any financing which is less than a year, so it's less than 12 months or per annum. Then when we go to long term, anything which is beyond 1 year, we tend to call it long-term source of finance. And so long-term sources of finance are those that are needed over a long period of time, usually over a year. If it's less than a year, then it's a short-term financing source. And usually we use them for more of capital-intensive projects, such as expansion, such as buying new premises, developing new products, acquiring another company, which you'd have to pay back over time. So usually the operating expenses and things, you use a short-term financing. But when it comes to long-term, then we are focusing more on capital-intensive projects usually. Some sources of long-term finance is what we call shares. And shares usually is companies which are limited by shares who tend to offer shares. What are shares? Shares are just representation of people's ownership stake in a company. And so people have contributed money to what run this business, and they are the owners of the business, and we call them the shareholders. And so we're saying that the most common source of raising long-term capital by a company, I made mention earlier that it is only companies that are able to issue shares. Sole proprietorship, partnership, you can't issue any share. And usually we have even types of companies, and companies which are limited by share are the ones which you see them working with shares. And so these shares are very good because at the end of the day, they are money which the business is going to be using, and they are not required to pay it back until the company is winding up, or it is collapsing. Let's put it like that, or the company is terminating before. However, when it comes to the shareholdings, there are two major types in there. We have the equity and then we have the preference shares. So those are the two main types of shares you may have to go in for in there. So let's look at them one by one. When we're looking at issue of equity shares, equity capital represents ownership capital as equity holders collectively own the business. So we have two main types of shareholders in there. We have the equity and we have the preference shareholders. When it comes to the equity, they are the people who actually own the business. So for these people, some characteristics or unique things that sets them apart is that they are rewarded as the bearer of risk of the ownership. Usually when it comes to equity shareholders, because they own it, and the risk, they also bear it a lot. And so you realize that even when there's profit and they declare dividends, the board of directors are the ones who declare dividend. And the dividend they declare is not enough to cater for all the equity, and can only cater for the preference shares. Once they pay, that means they may not get some. However, when it comes to dissolving the company, because of their risk in there, once they've cleared all these preference people, everything left is for them. And so that's some of the rewards they get in there. And there is no promise to the shareholders of a fixed dividend. Like I was saying, when dividends is usually declared after we've done the profit after tax, or yes, all the tax things have been taken out, and we've gotten the clear profits we need or we have for the company. And usually it's the directors who declare that we have dividend, and so we're going to pay dividend this year or not. And when they declare it, there's no fixed amount or promise that every year are going to receive dividend of X% in there, unlike the case of preference shareholders. And so the liability of equity shareholders or equity holders is usually limited to an agreed amount by the shareholders, and holders enjoy the residual of whatever is left after dividend is paid to bond and share other preference holders. So like I was saying, they enjoy what is left. So So if there's excess money and there's a lot of dividend, once the preference and bondholders are paid off, the rest of the money is all for them in there. Preference shareholders are different from the equity shareholders. And for preference, we're saying that the amount of share capital is raised by the issue of preference shares. So if you have equity shares, you're not a preference shareholder. If I hold equity shares, then you're a preference shareholder. And we're saying that preference shares represent some sort of, it has a blend of both the equity and a bit of debenture features in there. And so we're saying that equity shares, it resembles equity shares because preference is paid once there is what? Profit after tax, or when profit is declared or dividend is declared. However, it also resembles a debenture because it has a fixed rate of what? Return. So they'll tell you that it's 5% or 6% or 10% or something. There's a fixed rate of return whenever they're going to share dividend for you. And saying that the preference shares can either be cumulative, non-cumulative, participating, non-participating, redeemable, non-redeemable, convertible, and cumulative preference shares. These are the various forms it can take form of. So we have some which is redeemable, some is not redeemable, some are cumulative, some do not cumulate. So these are the various forms in which they take. But we call them hybrid because they take features of equity, and then they also take features of debenture. That is why we call them some sort of hybrid in there. Another source is what we call debentures. Debentures, yes. So debenture is actually an instrument which is issued by a company in acknowledgement of a debt which is taken under its common seal. So debentures are usually secured and are said to have fixed or floating charges. If a debenture is for land or building, it can be called a mortgage debenture. So these are some various types of debentures you have. Fixed charge means that there is a certain asset or there are some things which they would place it on that just in case this happens, this is what we're going to use to defray your cost. Floating means there's no fixed or specific things, and so it is hovering over just everything or all the assets and things in the company. And we have the mortgage, which is when it is secured towards what? A building. So just in case this happens, we're going to what? Sell off this building and use it to pay you back. So debenture holders have the right to receive their interest payment before any dividend is payable to what? Shareholders. So even before the preference shareholders are paid, debenture holders would have to be what? Paid. There are other sources of business ownership. Other sources of long-term finance is also what we call the asset leasing. So we're saying that when we're looking at a lease is an agreement between two parties, which is the leaser and then the leasee. And then we're saying that the leaser is the one who actually owns the capital asset, and then the lessee is the one who is going to what? Use it. And then they have some sort of terms and condition for the lease within a what? Specified period of time. So maybe 10 years lease, 100 years lease. Leases come in various years. Usually it's long term. So you can get a 10 years lease, 90 years, 100 years, all of them can be. But there are two main types of leases. We have the operating and we have the finance lease. So when we're looking at the operating lease, these are more like rental agreement installments that are charged against profit. And then we have the finance lease, which is agreements between the two parties, or for most or all of the assets expected useful life. So we know that this asset is going to be useful for like 5 years, and we have to scrap it off. So we're going to charge this amount based on what the asset's useful life. So there are basically two types. You have the operating lease and we have the financing leases as well. Another source of long-term capital is what we call mortgage. Yes, a lot of us in Ghana is now picking up, and so we see a lot of people now going in for mortgages instead of building their own houses as well. So mortgage is actually a long-term loan, which is usually on a property or a fixed asset. So it could be a building. Usually we see it a lot in Ghana when it comes to our houses. So people choose not to build, but they choose to go in for mortgage. And so a mortgage is a loan which is secured on land and building. Usually they are immovable assets of the company, and we use it to finance the purchase of those properties. And like I said, these are long-term things, usually like 10 or 30 years in there, and they have their own terms and conditions, because usually if you're not able to keep up to the mortgage payment. Or another source of long-term capital is what we call the venture capital. And when it comes to venture capital, it's actually a type of private equity capital, which is usually provided by outside investors to new and growing businesses. And so when businesses see potential for you, they have a pool of money, or they have some money they may want to push into your business. And we're saying that venture capital fund is actually a pool investment, and it's actually a pooled investment vehicle which primarily invests financial capital into third-party investors in enterprises that are too risky for standard capital markets or bank loans. You know, there are some businesses banks will not finance because of the capital inject and how risky it is. But for venture capitals, it can be a bit more daring, because yes, in business, more risk is caused with more returns or more profit. And so sometimes they may go beyond what the traditional banks may want to sponsor in there. And most venture capitals actually come from a group of wealthy individuals. It's usually a pool. So there are some rich people who have excess monies. They put it together, and then they pick startups or younger firms, and then they invest into it, and they get their returns from it. And usually they take some sort of equity ownership stake in your business, and so they'll take some percentage of ownership of your business along the way. And it comes in different forms as well. So most venture capitals come from wealthy individuals, investment banks, and other financial institutions, and sometimes the government, because in Ghana, we have the Ghana Venture Capital Trust Fund, which is actually state owned or by the government. And so to sum up in this session, we have discussed a number of long-term sources of finance available to the firm. Sources examined included shares, debentures, mortgage, assets leased, and even venture capitals.